They buried her on a Tuesday, the 2nd of May, 1967, under a sky the color of dishwater, and the ground at the Sublimity Cemetery took the rain the way it always does in the valley that time of year, slow, patient, like it had nowhere else to be. There were 11 people at the graveside. I counted them twice because counting was easier than listening to Pastor Rydell talk about a woman he'd met maybe 6 times in the last decade. My grandmother had outlived her friends the way she outlived everything else, stubbornly, without complaint, one winter at a time. I wore my father's black wool coat, too warm for the weather, because it was the only dark coat in the house. Mrs. Oison from the co-op squeezed my arm and told me I was young to be taking this on alone. Said it the way people say things they've already decided are true. I didn't answer her. I'd learned by 18 that agreeing with people was often faster than arguing and cost you nothing you couldn't get back. After the last car pulled off the gravel and onto the county road, I drove the truck, her 1951 Ford, the paint gone the color of a fir needle left too long in the sun, the 4 miles back to the farm alone. 26 acres, Marion County deed, recorded in her name since 1944, now recorded, the lawyer's letter said, in mine. I walked it before I went inside. The house could wait. The house had waited 70 years. It could wait one more afternoon. I went past the barn first, the roof line sagging on the north corner where the shakes had gone soft, and past the empty stanchions where she'd kept 2 Guernseys until her hip gave out in 1962. Then I came around the back line, where the fence ran along the property edge toward the Abaquah Creek bottom, and there it was, same as I'd known it my whole life without ever once really looking at it. The sawdust pile. Fir sawdust, gone gray-brown on the outside and still pale gold if you dug your boot in, banked up against the fence line in a long, low ridge that ran maybe 60 feet, higher than my head in the middle of it. The sublimity mill had been hauling it out here since before I was old enough to remember not having it, 14 years by my count, dumped free of charge onto the back of her land like the fence line was a landfill nobody bothered to ask about. I stood there a long while in the wet grass, hands in my coat pockets, listening to the creek 200 yards off and a mill whistle somewhere carrying faint on the wind from sublimity. She never once complained about it. Not in a letter, not in a conversation I could recall, not in 14 years of trucks backing up to her fence line and leaving their waste behind like it belonged there. I wondered, standing at the edge of that pile with the rain starting again, what a woman like her, careful with a dollar, careful with everything, had been waiting for. I went back inside before the rain got serious and started making a list, because that was the only thing I knew how to do with a problem too big to hold in my head at once. $62 in the coffee tin above the stove, a truck in the shed, a 1951 Ford F1 that turned over twice and then gave up entirely, the battery flat as a plate. A barn roof with a gap over the north stall you could see sky through, and underneath it, a wet dark stain spreading across the floorboards where the rain had been finding its way in for what looked like more than one winter. A wood stove that smoked when the wind came from the west. 4 hens, 1 rooster gone silent with age, a garden gone to weed at the edges, and a letter from the county bank in Silverton dated the week before she died, reminding her that the note on the house, a small one, 11 years old, $400 and some, was 30 days past due again, same as it had been most Mays, for longer than I wanted to think about. I slept that first week in my grandfather's old room because hers didn't feel right yet, under a quilt that smelled like cedar and mothballs, and I woke each morning before light out of habit from the mill, even though there was no mill shift to report to anymore. I'd lie there listening to the house tick and settle, to the creak, to nothing. Thursday morning, the 9th of May, I heard the trucks before I saw them, that low diesel grind coming up the county road, then slowing, then the particular groaning shift of gears a loaded logging truck makes backing itself around. I went out in my coat with my coffee still in my hand and watched two sublimity mill trucks back up to the fence line, same as they must have done every Thursday for 14 years, and dump their loads onto the pile without a man so much as looking toward the house. One driver lifted 2 fingers off the wheel at me, the way you'd wave at a fence post. I lifted mine back. I didn't stop them. I didn't know yet what there was to stop, or whether stopping was even mine to do. The pile wasn't costing me anything I could see, and I had a roof and a truck and a banknote stacked up ahead of it in my mind. So I let them come, the way she must have let them come, Thursday after Thursday, without comment, without complaint, for reasons I hadn't found yet. I went back inside and added roof to the top of my list, underlined twice, and did not think again that day about the sawdust, or about what a careful woman might have been doing with all of it for 14 quiet years. Dale Winship came out to the farm on Friday, May 12th, in a green Ford pickup with Sublimity Lumber Co., painted fresh on the door, the letters still bright enough to catch the morning sun. I was up on the barn roof with a hammer and a coffee can of nails when I heard him pull in, and I stayed up there a minute longer than I needed to, just to see what he'd do with the weight. He got out slow, the way heavy men do, and stood by his truck looking at the house like he was pricing it. He had on a canvas coat with a fur collar, even though it wasn't cold, and boots that had never once stood in a barn. I came down the ladder and wiped my hand before I offered it. He looked at it a second before he took it, like he was deciding whether it was worth the trouble. He didn't ask about the funeral. He didn't say her name. He said the mill had an arrangement going back to 1953, that his father had made it with my grandmother, I mean, though he said, your people, like the distinction, didn't matter to him, and that the arrangement was the sawdust went on the back line, and nobody paid anybody anything, and that was how it was going to stay. I said I hadn't asked him to change it. He said good, because there wasn't a lot of standing in it for me to change anyway. He said it in the voice men use when they've already decided the conversation is over and are only speaking to hear themselves close it out, not raising his voice, not needing to. He said a woman who'd lived on the place 50 years had understanding of certain things a boy just come back from the mill floor wasn't going to have yet. He said it kindly enough that I couldn't answer it without sounding like I was arguing with kindness. I asked him what the arrangement covered, exactly. Written down anywhere. He smiled like I'd told a joke that wasn't very good, and said his father never wrote anything down with a woman who was glad for the mulch. He said the pile had probably done my grandmother good over the years, kept the weeds back, and I ought to be grateful instead of asking about paper. I didn't tell him I didn't know yet whether that was true. I didn't tell him anything. I said I'd think on it, and he said there wasn't much to think on, and got back in his truck like a man closing an account that had never really been open to discussion in the first place. I watched him back down the drive the same unhurried way his truck's back to the fence line, and I went inside and wrote the date on a scrap of paper, Friday, May 12th, and under it, Winship says pile stays, no standing. I didn't know yet why I was keeping it. I only knew a thing had been said to me that I intended to remember exactly, word for word, in case it mattered later. The attic door had a hook latch, not a lock, though it had felt like a lock my whole childhood. Grandmother kept the ladder folded up against the hall ceiling and told me the boards up there were soft, that I'd put a foot through and break my neck, and I believed her the way you believe anything said in a flat voice by a woman who never repeated herself. I was 18 now and she was 3 days buried, and I stood under that hook latch on the evening of Saturday, May 13th, with the ladder creaking down on its spring hinge, and I thought, not for the first time that week, that a great many things she'd told me had been said to keep me out of rooms, rather than to keep me safe in them. The boards held fine. There was less up there than I expected. A rolled rug, a crate of canning jars gone cloudy with dust, a child's sled with a broken runner that must have been my mother's, and against the far wall, under the low slope of the roof where the light from my kerosene lamp barely reached, a cedar trunk with a strap hinge and a hasp that wasn't locked either. I knelt and opened it the way you'd open something you suspected might be empty, ready to be disappointed. It wasn't empty. On top lay a wool blanket, moth-eaten at one corner, and under that a leather-bound book, the cover cracked along the spine in a pale seam, the leather gone the color of an old saddle. I opened it to the first page and read, in her handwriting, small and upright and even, the words "Garden Diary," begun this 4th day of April, 1938. I sat back on my heels and read for longer than I meant to, until the lamp burned low enough that I had to trim the wick. She'd written about rainfall and frost dates, about a hen that wouldn't set, about the price of seed potatoes at the Silverton Co-op that spring, 11 cents a pound, she'd noted, robbery, and folded into the back cover, soft at the creases from being opened and closed many times, was a single sheet of graph paper, ruled by hand, columns headed in her small print, date, row, pH, bloom, yield, QT. The numbers ran down the page in her ink, year after year, 1938, through some year I hadn't gotten to yet, and next to several of the earliest entries, in the margin, she'd written one word I had to hold the lamp close to read. Sawdust. I sat there a long while with the trunk open and the house silent below me, and the lamp hissing softly, and I did not yet understand what I was looking at, only that it was not nothing, and that whatever Dale Winship believed about what his father's sawdust had or hadn't done for her, she had been writing it down, in numbers, for longer than I had been alive. I turned back to the first page and started again, slower this time, reading it the way she must have written it, not as a story but as a record, one entry building on the one before. May 14th, 1938. Row 2, sawdust applied 3 inches, pH 6.8. She'd tested it with a kit ordered from a Portland seed house, the receipt still tucked between 2 pages, $1.15 plus postage. By July that year, the same row read pH 6.1, and beside it, berries larger, held color longer, ground stayed cool under hand at noon. Row 1, untreated, no note on size, only yield 4 QT. Row 2, mulched, yield 7 QT. She had not guessed. She had measured. The next spring she added row 3 and row 4, doubled the sawdust on row 2, kept a control row bare on purpose. Row 5, marked plainly, no sawdust, comparison only. By 1941, her pH readings had settled into a pattern I could see even without her explaining it, the mulched rows dropping half a point, sometimes more, staying there through August, when the unmulched ground baked hard and pale. Bloom dates came 4-5 days earlier on the mulched rows. Moisture held 2 weeks longer after rain, she'd written once, pressing her pencil hard enough that I could feel the letters on the back of the page. 11 years of it. 1938 through 1949, the ink changing from a fountain pen's blue-black to a ballpoint's thinner blue somewhere around the war years, the handwriting never changing, small and even, a woman keeping her own accounts the way she must have kept the farms, nobody looking over her shoulder, nobody she had to convince. In 1944 she'd written, "Winship's boy hauled a load Tuesday, no charge, same as always, nothing more." She did not seem to think it strange that a mill would give its waste away for free onto a widow's fence line. Maybe it wasn't strange then. Maybe it was only strange now. 40 years turned it strange, with the son grown into a man who charged for everything and called dumping a favor. Then, on a page dated April 1949, the entries simply stopped. No note of a bad year, no line about frost or debt or a decision made. The last figure was a pH reading, row 3 5.9, the best number on the page, better than anything she'd recorded before it, and under it, nothing. Half the page left blank, the graph paper's faint blue lines running on toward the bottom, with no ink in them at all, like a road that had been surveyed and never built. I sat with the trunk lid propped against my knee and the lamp guttering low, turning that blank half page over in my mind the way you turn a stone looking for what's written on the underside. 11 years of careful proof, and then 11 years of silence after it, the diary itself going on for another page or two about hens and weather before it, too, stopped for good. Something had happened in that gap between 1949 and whatever came after. I didn't know what yet, but I knew where to start asking. Wednesday morning, I drove the 3 miles to the Bakke place with the diary wrapped in a feed sack on the truck seat beside me, the way you'd carry something that might not survive rough handling. Elsie Bakke was 71 that spring, widowed 9 years, and she'd known my grandmother since before either of them had married. She was hanging wash when I pulled in, clothespins in her apron pocket, and she watched me come up the drive with the particular patience of someone who has buried enough people to know that young men only visit unannounced when they're carrying a question. I showed her the PH page. I asked her what happened in 1949. She set down the wet shirt she was holding and told me to sit on the porch step, and she told it plain, the way farm women tell hard things, without much decoration. There'd been a frost the second week of May that year, a hard one, the kind that comes after 2 weeks of false warmth and catches everything in bloom. My grandmother had 9 rows in by then, all mulched, all charted, and she'd been talking around the county about her sawdust method. Proud of it, Elsie said, prouder than she ever let on afterward. The frost took the whole bloom in one night. Not half the crop, all of it. She'd borrowed against that season at the Silverton Bank the winter before, new plants, new stakes, a hand duster for the aphids. And when the crop failed, there was nothing to sell and nothing to pay with. The bank's man came out twice that summer. Foreclosure papers were drawn and not filed, Elsie said, only because my grandfather still had the timber lease income that year to cover the note. But word got around. People at the Grange meeting made remarks. A man from the extension office had written her methods up once, favorably, and after the frost, he never mentioned her name again in his bulletins. She never said she was ashamed, Elsie told me, folding the wet shirt over her arm without looking at it. She just got quiet, kept the hens, kept a garden the size of a garden, sold eggs and put the sawdust talk away like a coat she didn't want to be seen wearing. I asked why she'd let the mill keep dumping at all, after that, if the sawdust had cost her so much. Elsie considered it a while, the way old women consider things before they'll commit to saying them out loud. Habit, maybe, she said. Or she never stopped believing the ground under it, just stopped believing folks would let her be right about it twice. I drove home with that sentence riding in the cab with me the whole 3 miles, turning it the same way I'd turned the blank half-page the night before, and by the time I pulled up to the barn, I understood the diary wasn't a record of a woman who'd failed. It was a record of a woman who'd stopped, mid-sentence, still correct. The county agent's office sat above the feed store on Water Street in Silverton, 1 flight of stairs that smelled of grain dust and pipe tobacco, and I climbed them on a Thursday morning with the chart folded in my shirt pocket like something that might blow away. His name was Carl Bueller, and he had a calendar from the Silverton Grange tacked behind his desk, the days of May crossed off in red pencil up through the 2nd. I laid the chart flat in front of him and let him read it before I said anything. He read it the way a man reads a letter he already suspects the contents of, and when he set it down, he didn't look at me first. He looked at the window. "Your grandmother's hand," he said, not a question. I told him what I meant to do. 9,000 plants, sawdust mulch, the rows laid out the way the chart showed them, bloom dates and all. He let me finish, which I appreciated, and then he told me that raw fir sawdust pulls nitrogen out of the soil as it breaks down, that it holds acid a berry plant can tolerate, but a root crown can't, that he had seen 3 separate operations in Lynn County lose whole plantings to crown rot inside 2 seasons, from mulch laid too thick and too fresh. He said it plainly, without unkindness, the way a man states a fact he has stated before to other people who didn't listen either. She stopped for a reason, he said, tapping the blank half-page I hadn't shown him, but he seemed to know was there anyway. I'd study on that before I put money in the ground. I went from there to the cannery buyer, a man named Orville Fensky, who bought contract fruit for the Marion County Co-op out of a converted garage on the highway, scales and crates stacked to the rafters, and a black telephone that rang twice while I stood there. He looked at the chart the way a man looks at a check he suspects won't clear. Told me the valley's contract growers mulched with straw or nothing at all. That sawdust mulch was a homesteader's habit from before anybody knew better, and that if I wanted a cannery contract I'd need conventional rows he could guarantee to buyers in Portland who didn't care what year it was on my grandmother's page. Rot takes the whole field, he said. Every year somebody has to learn that fresh. I thanked him and folded the chart back into my pocket and walked out past the crates of last year's beans, and driving home along the Sublimity Road with the mill smoke standing straight up in the still morning, I understood that I had just been told, in 2 rooms 20 minutes apart, exactly what she had been told once, and had believed, long enough to go quiet about it, 30 years before I was born to hear the argument for myself. The bank in Silverton sat on the corner of Water and First, brick front, gold lettering, a clock in the window that ran 4 minutes slow. I went in on Thursday, the 11th of May, wearing my father's good shirt, and asked for a loan officer by name, because the woman at the counter looked ready to send me to a teller instead. Roy Ammon came out from behind a glass partition, shook my hand like he wasn't sure it would hold weight, and listened while I laid the chart on his desk next to the deed. He read the yield columns twice. He asked how old I was, though the deed already told him, and I said 18, and he nodded the way men nod when they've decided something before you finish talking. He approved $740 against the farm at 6%, due in 18 months, and had me sign in triplicate with a pen that skipped on the second line. Riding the bus back to Sublimity that afternoon, I did the arithmetic on the back of the loan slip. 9,000 plants at just under 8 cents apiece. The rest held back for stakes, twine, and the difference between what a boy thinks a season costs and what it actually does. The hood plants came up from a nursery outside Corvallis on the 18th, bare root and bundled in wet burlap, and I set them the way her chart told me to, 18 inches apart, rows running north-south the way she'd drawn them. Sawdust worked 4 inches deep and pulled back an inch from each crown so the wood wouldn't smother what it was meant to protect. It rained 9 of the next 14 days, a slow gray rain that never announced itself as anything more than Oregon being Oregon, and I worked in a canvas coat that never fully dried, my knees black to the shin by the 2nd week of June. There is a particular kind of tired that comes from bending 9,000 times over, and a particular kind of debt that comes from doing it with money that isn't yours yet. I thought about both in about equal measure, kneeling in mud that smelled of resin and rot in the same breath, setting each plant the depth of 2 knuckles, the way the diary said, no deeper. Somewhere behind me the pile stood the way it always had, patient as a debt of its own, and I understood without writing it down that there was no unplanting 9,000 strawberries once they were in the ground, that whatever came of this, dry summer or ruined field, I had already spent money I didn't have on a method 2 men in one morning had told me was already proven wrong. June closed out wet and turned on the first Monday of July as if someone had shut a door. By the 2nd week, there was no rain in the forecast the Statesman Journal printed each morning, and by the 3rd, there was none in the sky to argue with it. The ditch along the county road went to dust. I drove into Silverton on the 9th for chicken feed and passed 3 fields on contract to the cannery, Rasmussen's, the Todd place, and a 40-acre stretch I didn't know the name of, and every one of them had gone the color of a scab, the soil pulled back from the crowns in cracks wide enough to lose a finger in. A man at the feed store said the valley hadn't seen a July like it since '54, and said it like a fact he was proud to carry, the way men carry bad weather, as though it were a hand of cards they'd been dealt fair and square. My rows didn't crack. I walked them morning and evening with a trowel, turning back an inch of sawdust here and there to check the ground beneath it, and the ground beneath it stayed the color of coffee grounds, dark and cool, holding whatever the 9 days of rain had left in it like a fist that hadn't opened. I wrote it down the way she had, in a hand that started out careful and got looser as June became July, became the kind of long, silent stretch where a man talks mostly to animals and himself. Bloom dates in one column, the way hers had run in 1938, 1941, 1944. Moisture noted by feel, since I owned no meter and wouldn't have trusted one over my own thumb. Runners I pinched back, so the plants would put their strength into the crown, instead of spreading themselves thin across the row, the way she'd written it, though I only understood why once I'd done it myself and watched the difference in a week. I was up before 5 most mornings, and in the barn past dark most nights, and somewhere in that stretch I stopped counting the days since the funeral and started counting towards something else. Bloom to green fruit was running 11 days shorter than her old notes from the wet years, which meant either the dry heat was pushing them or I'd misread her hand on a date, and I didn't know which, and there was no one left living who could tell me. Dorothy Neubauer came by on the 17th, stood at the end of a row with her hands on her hips, and said nothing for a long moment, before she said only that she hadn't expected to see green fruit already, not from her, not from anyone, not in dirt like that. I told her it wasn't dirt, it was sawdust holding dirt together. She looked at the pile behind the barn a long while after that, like she was doing arithmetic she hadn't done in 18 years. The first berries came off the 10th of July, a Monday, and they came off clean. No grit worked into the flesh, no soft rot spots from lying against wet clay, just red fruit sitting up on a bed of gray-brown dust like eggs in a nest. I picked into lug boxes my grandmother had kept stacked in the barn since before I was born, and I filled 14 of them that first morning before the heat came up hard enough to stop me. I drove past the cannery buyer's scale on my way into town and did not stop. I set 2 sawhorses and a door plank at the end of the drive instead, chalked a board with a price, 20 cents a pound, same as the valley average, no better, no worse, because I wanted the fruit to do the talking and not the number, and sat on an upturned bucket most of that first afternoon, wondering if anyone would slow down at all. By Wednesday, I didn't have to wonder. A woman from 4 miles east bought 6 quarts and asked where I'd gotten strawberries that looked like that in a dry summer when her own patch was cracking on the vine. I told her the truth, that they were mulched in mill sawdust, and she looked at me the way people look at something they've decided not to believe yet, but might come around to. She came back Friday with her sister. By the following week, cars I didn't recognize were pulling off the county road, and twice I had to send someone home empty-handed because I'd sold out by 2 in the afternoon, which had never once happened to my grandmother in 11 years of keeping this ground, not according to anything in her diary. The agricultural agent drove out on a Tuesday near the end of the month, stood at the edge of the first row with his hat pushed back, and didn't say much beyond that he'd have to see the yield figures at season's end before he changed his opinion of sawdust mulch, which struck me as fair, since I hadn't changed mine about much else either. What he did say, on his way back to his truck, was that word had already reached the co-op office in Silverton, that a Halverson boy on the old county line was selling berries that looked too clean to be real, and that 2 of the contract growers had asked him outright whether it was true. I didn't go looking for that kind of talk. It came to the stand on its own, the way water finds the low ground, and by the first week of August I was turning away more cars on a Saturday than the biggest grower on Miller Road, a man who'd been in strawberries longer than I'd been alive. The last truck came on a Thursday, the 14th of August. The driver, a man I didn't recognize, who dumped his load without cutting the engine and was back on the county road inside 4 minutes. After that, nothing. I gave it a week before I let myself notice, and another week before I let myself worry. The way you wait to mention a cow hasn't come to the gate in case she's only wandered. By the 1st of September, the pile at the back line had shrunk to something a man could walk over without losing his boot, and I understood what I was looking at. Winship had done his arithmetic same as I'd done mine, only his came out the other direction. 14 years he'd been rid of a problem for free. Now the problem was making a boy on the old county line richer than his own hauling costs justified, and there wasn't a version of that math that sat easy with a man like him. My grandmother had never had to ask, because she'd never needed to be asked. She took what came over the fence line and called it Providence, and wrote her numbers in a ledger nobody read. I didn't have that luxury. My rows for the following spring were already marked out in my head, and marked out rows without mulch were just dirt with ambition. I sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening with her chart in front of me, and did the sum plainly. 9,000 plants wanted roughly the tonnage that pile had once held, and tonnage like that didn't walk itself 26 acres from sublimity. So on a Tuesday morning, the 12th of September, 1967, I put on a clean shirt, folded her chart and my own notes on July's rainfall into an envelope, and drove the truck the 11 miles to the mill, thinking the whole way about what a man says when he's asking for something his family used to get handed to them without a word spoken. I found Winship in the yard, in his shirt sleeves, going over a load ticket with a scaler. He looked up at me the way he had that first week in May, like I was a delivery he hadn't ordered. I told him I wasn't there to ask for anything free. I told him I was there to talk business, on paper, if he had a minute and a pencil. He didn't answer right away. He looked past me at the truck, then back at my face, like he was deciding whether the boy standing in his yard was the same one who'd stood there in May, or somebody else entirely wearing his coat. He gave me the pencil first. I laid it out plain. The county landfill was 14 miles past his mill in the other direction, and every load he trucked there cost him diesel and a man's morning. My 26 acres sat closer, and my back line had taken his sawdust for 14 years without a dime changing hands. I wasn't asking him to keep that arrangement. I was asking him to pay for it, in writing, dated, the way a business pays for a service, instead of leaning on a widow's silence. He said his father had never charged her because she never made him feel he owed her anything. I said I understood that, and that I wasn't her, and this wasn't 1953. He looked at the scaler, who found something interesting in his boots, and then Winship laughed once, short, not unkind, and said he supposed a boy who could grow strawberries in mill waste could probably read a contract too. We settled on $4 a load, paid monthly, the mill hauling to my back line same as always, only now, with a receipt book and my signature on a sheet we both kept a copy of. He drew it up himself on mill letterhead, dated the 12th of September, 1967, and signed it, Dale R. Winship, Sublimity Lumber Co. I signed under him, Peter A. Halverson, and folded my copy into the same envelope that had carried her chart. Driving home, I passed the turnoff to the cemetery and didn't stop. There wasn't anything left to say there that the field wasn't already saying for me. That was the last September I counted in careful numbers. The plants are still in the ground, coming into their third full season now, and the roadside stand has a hand-lettered sign my grandmother would have found too proud, though I noticed she never once complained about the customers lined up along the fence in July. I think about the diary more than I think about the man who wouldn't shake my hand that first week. 11 years of her handwriting, stopped by one frost and a bank that didn't believe in her either, sitting in a trunk in a room I wasn't allowed into as a boy. I've started keeping my own now, same ruled pages, same plain hand, in case there's a grandson someday who needs proof that the ground already told somebody the answer, 40 years before he asked the question. If you've been called too young for the work in front of you, I'd guess there's a drawer somewhere in your family nobody's opened lately. Go look. And if you've got a story like this one, tell it below. I'd like to read it.